Good morning and welcome to Community Conversations. I'm Vicki Green. Today's show is very timely with Veterans Day this month, and we're talking about a true hidden gem in Massachusetts that I guarantee many of you listening have never heard of or seen. And it's called the American Heritage Museum in Stowe. The entrance is in Hudson, I will say that. It's on Main Street in Hudson, set back off the road, and the American Heritage Museum is located in Stowe. So this museum has been created by the Collings Foundation. And here with me today to discuss this brand new living history museum is Executive Director and pilot Rob Collings. Good morning, Rob.
Good morning, Vicki.
And he has along with him Hunter Cheney, who is the Director of Marketing for the Collings Foundation.
Hi, good morning, Vicki.
Thanks for joining me today. Rob, your parents started the Collings Foundation back in 1979. And your dad, I know, was a car buff. And then 10 years later, so around 89, he amassed this collection of historic aircraft, classic cars, some of the only ones on display in the world, and many of them are in Stowe. And he started what millions around the country and many locally here in the Worcester area have seen at the airport. It's the Wings of Freedom tour. So where did this all come from?
That's a very good question. My father grew up in the Midwest in the 50s, and he was, like most kids in the Midwest in the 50s, into hot rods. So the car was your form of expression. It was your form of freedom to get out and do what you wanted to do. It came a time when in the 70s, he had now the ability to go out and start to buy antique cars. He started to amass a collection. And they were focused on pre-World War II American. What are the most important American vehicles from 1901 up until the start of World War II? So the collection starts with a 1901 Curve Dash Oldsmobile. We have steam cars, electric cars. You get into the 30s with the classic era cars, and the vehicle transcends transportation at that point. They are forms of rolling art. Ironically, at the height of the Depression, were the most elegant and tasteful cars ever built, and probably some of the most technologically advanced given their time.
Okay, so Hunter, many people know about the Wings of Freedom tour, but for those that don't, can you tell us a little bit about the aircraft and what's been involved with that? And I think I read about 4 million people have seen this over the years? Annually.
Yes.
Around the world. 4 million people around the world have seen the aircraft piece, which is different. It's run by the Collings Foundation, but different from the American Heritage Museum.
Yeah.
So how did it transcend from the planes to the American Heritage Museum?
Well, the National Wings of Freedom Tour is the most long-lived historic aircraft tour in the world. So we started back 29 years ago with this tour of World War II bomber and fighter aircraft. The thought is if people have a chance to truly experience something from World War II history, like touring through or flying in these World War II aircraft, this tour itself acts as an excellent vehicle to do just what we set out to do, which is engage people in history as a means to better understand it. So every year, we take these beautifully restored World War II bomber and fighter aircraft. It features the B-17 Flying Fortress. You remember the old film like 12 O'Clock High, Memphis Belle? These are old
I do.
wartime films. So the B-17, I always look at it as kind of the Hollywood bomber, because everyone recognizes, oh, the B-17. And so this is one of 9 flying now. And we have another 4-engine heavy bomber, a B-24 Liberator. A very iconic aircraft, and the reason it's so iconic is it was the most mass-produced American aircraft in our history. So over 18,000 of these aircraft were made, basically one every hour at the height of production.
Wow.
Incredible. And so of course, a B-24 Liberator, and then we have a B-25 Mitchell, is the same type of aircraft that was used during the Doolittle raid, and a P-51 Mustang. And so every year, for the last 29 years, we take this tour to over 100 cities across the United States. So we start in Florida in January every year and do this giant zigzag clockwise loop.
And you were at Worcester Airport.
Yeah, at Worcester Airport, and we typically come there every year in September time, in the fall. And so we visit these cities that otherwise wouldn't have a chance to see such a display. And the experience is just over the top. It's one thing to see a historic aircraft in a museum setting, but to fly in one, to crawl through one, it takes on a whole different experience.
And that brings us to the American Heritage Museum, because you talk about living history and experience, an experiential time to be able to walk through this history. So, Rob, you've flown a lot of these planes, correct?
I've been very fortunate over the years to fly not only the tour aircraft, the B-24, the B-17, P-51, and B-25, but to fly a lot of the other aircraft that are part of the Collins Foundation and experience them, but also to meet a lot of the veterans who flew these aircraft and to share in their stories and experience flying with them has just been an amazing opportunity.
So you got your pilot's license, or you did your first solo when you were 16, is that right?
Yeah, just like 4 years ago.
Sure, I'll go with that.
A little longer than that.
I'll go with that. Yeah, and I drove a World War II tank. No.
Yeah.
I think the plane that you checked out in is the same Stearman we have.
It is, yes.
You mean the very first flight you did?
The first solo, when you fly by yourself, was in a Stearman, which is still part of the foundation.
So you were in this environment as a kid because your dad had this nostalgic quality about, even if he started with cars and then the planes. And now you have your own kids, and I was lucky enough to go through the American Heritage Museum this past weekend. They're doing a soft opening, which means they're open for the rest of the month on the weekends, limited hours, because you're still working through some of obviously the gift shop's going to go in. There's going to be some more display, and you're working out some other parts of the business. So it's going to open in April, is that right?
That's correct. We'll have our grand opening in April. Through the course of the winter, we'll be working on a lot of the scenic displays around the vehicles. We have about 85 major artifacts, from the very first American tank to the most current American tank, an M1A1 Abrams, and it's the only one on display anywhere in the world, publicly on display.
The one being used that was used in Afghanistan?
This one particularly was used in Iraq.
In Iraq. So this is the only one on display in the world?
Correct.
And you have to come to Stowe?
Yes. Who would have thought Stowe, Massachusetts, yes, to come see this vehicle.
That otherwise, unless you're serving overseas, you're not going to see it. You have
never seen one. Correct.
And I got to say, that really did touch me. And I think when I saw your kids and I asked them what they thought of it, again, they're there all the time, I'm sure, with Dad and looking at this. But just to see, your son was just so, and your daughter, both of them were very intrigued by certain things. And so why did the foundation decide to embark on expanding your site to now, it's about 100 acres, right? And why build this museum? You've been doing the air tours, but why build an actual museum in Stowe, Massachusetts?
So the emphasis of the Wings of Freedom Tour has been on honoring our nation's veterans. That's what it started doing back 29 years ago. Its mission has progressed not only to honoring American veterans, unfortunately there's less and less World War II veterans, to educating the younger generations of the sacrifice that was made and how important it is to keep our freedom, and how many people sacrifice their lives so we can be free today. Free here, free in Europe, free in the Pacific, that the world can be a much better place to live in. So we felt we were doing a very good job for the air crew. And we'd been to, Hunter, over 3,000 different tour stops across this country to share these aircraft with the public and to have the veterans come out. But you might think that everything we were doing was related to the air war, and it was. That was our focus. But there was a lot more to World War II than just the air war. So back about 10 years ago, we decided we wanted to do something to bring living history to life for the guys who fought on the ground. And that was a World War II reenactment, which we've been doing in Stowe on a fall weekend, a Columbus Day weekend for the last 10 years. We'll have about 350 reenactors out there, tanks.
350?
350. So you ask about what we do with living history. That's one of the main focuses, is where people can come in, they can go into the tent of an American or of a German or of a British, see what their life was like. And then there's a battle reenactment that goes on. Not to glorify war, but to show people how horrific war is.
I think that's an important point, too.
Absolutely.
That none of this, when I walked through, was none of it I saw as glorifying war.
No, because war is not great. And so, to put it very mildly,
Yes,
we don't
great.
want to go to war.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, with our country, we have had to go to war many times throughout our history. And if you have to go to war, you want to make sure that the men and women who go over there and serve are the best trained, the best equipped, and given the best chance to come home alive. That's very important. But if we can avoid war, we always want to avoid war. If one thing comes out of this whole museum is that my son never has to go to war, it's good. And I want to make sure people realize that when you go through this museum, it's to emphasize the mistakes we've made in our history and that we've had to go to war oftentimes because we've let situations go too far.
And the costs of it.
So, but we also want to honor everyone that has served in our military.
And not just World War II.
Not
This
just
is
World
where
War II.
The museum
So-
has 18.
We actually go from historically having artifacts that go back to the Revolutionary War period up to current day today. The emphasis, though, is mostly on World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Gulf War, and then the war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan. Those are the major areas that we cover, and everything's in a chronological order. So when people go through, they can understand the history, and also to make the connections that war begets war in a lot of scenarios. World War I was called the Great War before World War II came along. It was never called World War I at the armistice about 100 years ago. It was the Great War. There was nothing great about it, but it was just known that way.
Right.
Only when World War II got started did they start to refer to it as World War I, in large part because World War I started World War II.
And that's why everyone
It was
always
a pause.
Everyone talks about World War III now, but there's a big pause.
Oh, yeah.
And
There's
we're
a big
praying that
pause,
pause
yeah.
never releases itself,
Yeah.
I guess.
So we want people to understand the history. We want to honor these veterans that are coming through and do something where they can come out and show their kids and grandkids what it was that they did, the sacrifices they made. And it might be our World War II veterans, but also could be someone who served in Korea, Vietnam, or even more recent conflicts in the Gulf. And that, to me, is something very special about the American Heritage Museum, is we don't just focus in on one period in time, as a lot of museums do. You might have the National World War II Museum that's phenomenal down in New Orleans, but it's only focused on a 5-year period in history, basically. Here, we're taking it and we're talking about a multi-year period, the last 100-plus years we're talking about. And then veterans. Now, there are far more veterans alive today who served in Vietnam than World War II.
Right.
And there's more veterans alive that served in Iraq and Afghanistan than Vietnam. So where were they going to go to show their families what they did and to keep their memory of their service alive?
And I think what was so terrific when I walked through, again, we're talking about the American Heritage Museum, just to remind folks, my guest in studio, Rob Collings, who's the executive director of the museum, of the Collings Foundation of the museum, and a pilot, and the director of marketing for the Collings Foundation, Hunter Cheney, are both with me. And we're talking about the American Heritage Museum, which is in Stowe, Massachusetts, for those of you that don't know, Metro West. The entrance is in Hudson. We can easily find it on the website, and we'll give you that information at the end of the show. But when you come off the road, and it's this very long access road, and then you come upon this giant building, and I really didn't know what to expect. So I walked in, and I knew about the aircraft, and I really thought I was going to see a lot of planes and learn a lot about the war. But when I walked through, and you say experiential, I started off, it's a mix of videos. It's a mix of what you're calling artifacts, many of which are tanks. There's, I think I saw a Scud missile. I don't want to give away too much, but up to kind of the ID robots, and it's the old tanks and the German cars, and everything goes in chronological order, as you said. And you start with this opening video that gets you from the Revolutionary War to World War I, but then you get to go into this. I don't want to give it away, but everyone has to experience it.
Oh, you got to give it away.
Yeah,
Come on.
I had I love history, but again, I don't want to give away my age, but my grandfather, who is no longer alive, God bless his soul, but he served in World War II. And so I do have a connection. And I have friends that served in Iraq and in the Gulf War, so I do have a connection. But when I walked through and I actually saw this, and Rob, I was lucky enough that you happened to be there and see your passion and see the volunteers' passion, because there are going to be more guides, but right now with the soft opening, there are guides and volunteers doing this, some of whom are vets, some of whom are not. They're just history buffs. But when I went into this beginning of World War I, and you're standing in this trench, and if listeners can imagine, there's videos going on, there's displays in front of you. I'm standing on the ground, and the ground is shaking as if I'm in, and there's barbed wire, and it's like you
are
like
in a trench.
In a trench. And it says in the video, 200,000, just so you understand where you're standing, trying to make you feel what it was like to stand in there years ago. 200,000 American soldiers died in a trench in World War I. That's not total deaths, but who died in the trenches of World War I. And you're able to stand in there and let that have what it's going to impact different people different ways. And that's probably, I'm guessing, your purpose.
Absolutely. The World War I trench is an immersive theater where you climb down into the trench. We want you to grasp the horror of what it was like to be sitting in this muddy, miserable place. San Miel was the first American-led battle.
And by the way, there's no mud in the museum. Just so people
there's no mud,
I
but it's made to look like a muddy trench. People were dying in the trench from shelling. There was gas attacks. There was disease. There would be rats running around. This was a horrid place to be. And they called World War I the war to end all wars because it was so horrific. And in fact, a lot of countries lost virtually all of their male population of a certain age. France, Britain, and so forth. There is one country in World War I that lost 26% of its entire population. That's how horrific it was. And I would challenge most people to say, how did World War I get started? It's this calamity of events, of an assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in this country declaring war on that country, declaring war on this country because their brother was the Archduke's cousin or something like that. Why did it get started? It's the most horrific war in history in some regards because of its proximity and what it did to the continent of Europe.
And then we became World War I, as you said, because there was another World War.
And that's the next gallery you go into is war clouds. How did World War I lead to World War II? We made some major mistakes. The Treaty of Versailles was so onerous against the Germans because France wanted payback. They were upset. They were devastated, their country. Germany's going to pay for it. They're going to pay to rebuild France. They're going to pay for everything. And that led to a National Socialist movement, the Nazi Party in Germany. And a lot of things that we prohibited them from doing, they went and did. They couldn't build tanks under the Treaty of Versailles. So what did they do? They built tanks. And we have one of those. They would call them tractors.
We're building tractors.
The Panzer I tank was built as a tractor. And they were doing other things surreptitiously to militarize. But they weren't militarizing to fight World War I. They were militarizing to fight the next war. Because why? Hitler was in those trenches. Adolf Hitler was a corporal. He was gassed. He was upset about how Germany was treated, and also how people treated him and his veterans when he came back home. Most of the persecution of socialists and Jews was because the socialists and Jews hated the veterans, the German veterans that came back. That's why he had such a platform. So you need to understand history to know how war gets started. And World War II, Winston Churchill describes as the most avoidable conflict in history. We went and had a war where 50 million people got killed that which could have ended in 1938 with only a few thousand people getting killed, but no one wanted to do anything at that point. That's what we want to have people walk away with, to think about, to leave the museum, even at that point if you don't see the rest of it, to leave the museum and have a conversation with your family or the people you went with, and to think about all of these events and how they can be avoided. That's one of the major goals we have.
And I will say that it did have that impact on me because we did talk about that. And then I started at the end of it thinking of parallels, and you said you want people to have this discussion, whether or not they go home and discuss it with their family or their kids, or they go for themselves and look at this research to figure out, or history, to figure out how things got started so that it doesn't, Hunter, you were saying, so that it doesn't repeat itself. Now, many of the artifacts are tanks, and you acquired, this is just amazing to me, in 2013, this tank collection from a guy who was in California who knew of your dad and your mom, I'm assuming, knew of the foundation. And why don't you walk us through how you got these in some cases, one-of-a-kind artifacts to bring to Stowe, Massachusetts?
Well, as I mentioned, the foundation was trying to do something for the veterans who served on the ground, to tell an encompassing story of World War II. It was really what we were telling at that time. And the tour had been going on for quite a long time, and this gentleman by the name of Jacques Littlefield was a supporter of the Collins Foundation. I had the pleasure of flying with Jacques in a P-51 Mustang, even to do a type rating for him in a B-17. And with that, I got a chance to go see the most phenomenal collection of military vehicles privately owned in the world.
But explain what he did for a living.
So Jacques was...
he was at HP, wasn't he?
Well, Jacques came from quite a bit of family money. He was a very intelligent guy. He was a Stanford graduate, worked at HP, but at some point in his life he said, I really want to follow my passion, which is collecting and preserving these military vehicles. And he had the means to do that in a very major way. And he did. Some of the artifacts, the vehicles that he had amassed in his collection are one-of-a-kinds. You could not go out there today and buy any of these for any amount of money because he had the vision to go out and find them. Probably the crown jewel is the Panther tank. This came out of which we have. It's on display, and it is certainly in front and center in the museum, what you'll see. This came out of a river in Poland when the wall came down in 1991. It was dug out of this river where it had been sitting since 1944 when it went through the ice. The restoration on this was tens of thousands of man-hours to bring it back to its original state. So without Jacques' vision and also very, very large checkbook to make sure all of this happened, these vehicles wouldn't be here today. Unfortunately, Jacques passed away of cancer in 2009. And it left this large collection with his family and not a very clear idea of what to do with it. Because he was 59 when he died. He planned on living a long time and doing more with his incredible collection. So the family had to think about, well, what would he want to do next? And that's where we were fortunate to come in, and they asked us, do you want to do something with this collection?
Wow.
And the story goes, I was meeting with the president of the Military Vehicle Technology Foundation, the nonprofit that Jacques had created for his vehicles. And we were discussing us buying, the Collins Foundation, buying a couple of vehicles to put on display. And at the end of the long day of conversation, Mr. Bowler, Bill Bowler, said, "I don't want to sell you a tank." And I thought, wow, okay, what have I been doing? And then he said, "I want to make sure you have the whole collection." And that was a very special moment. And that's how we had the opportunity to transition a collection to this museum.
And you did auction off some of his collection, but what in the money from the auction was used to fund the building of the American? Is that right, Hunter?
Right. The proceeds did. Yes.
Okay. So, what's the biggest takeaway as we wrap up that you want folks to get if they're able to get there by the end of the month for the soft opening? If not, it opens in April. What's the biggest takeaway you want folks to get from this experience?
An appreciation for the history. When you come through and see these artifacts, what we're trying to do is not show people artifacts. We're trying to convey the stories of the men, in most cases, that served on these vehicles and their sacrifices, and even some women. And this is a little-known story that we have. You go to the Eastern Front, and there's a tank there, a Russian T-34-76, and it was crewed by female tank crew members. There's a section in the crossing of the Rhine where you learn the story of the Black Panthers, which was the first segregated black tank unit.
I know, I never even knew tanks
Never
were
even knew
segregated.
that, but you'll know someone who was part of that unit because he was Jackie Robinson, one of the most famous baseball players of all time. So there's a lot of stories of the people who are there, and that's what we want you to take away. And I think you had alluded to the Abrams tank, and it's a very special vehicle, as we had mentioned,
Used
the
in Iraq.
only one on public display anywhere in the world, but also it brings to a close the sacrifices that were made. And while it's fun to go around and see these vehicles, they all have a terrible story associated with them. In this particular one, we know the story. And in August 3rd of 2006, this tank hit an IED in Iraq.
And you can see the damage on it. You showed me.
And
the
you can see the
on this
damage on it. And the commander, Sergeant George Yola, was killed. This is not a very obscure thing to think of, as we could see a Soviet tank from World War II with shell rounds in it. This is a 23-year-old kid, really, from Austin, Texas, who had 3 children of his own. And his story is being told there by the crew members who served with him. And that story of sacrifice, I think, is what we want to convey the most.
Okay, and I want to wrap up with something that you said to me about the percentage of people that were never even alive. When that you have a piece of debris, I'll say debris, as an artifact from 9/11. And what was the statistic you gave to me? I just want to wrap up the show with, so people understand it's not just for veterans.
Yes.
And it's not. It's there to tell a bigger story.
No, it's not for veterans. And most of the people coming through, you see a lot of young children. And the artifact you're alluding to is about a 10-foot tall section of the World Trade Center, twisted, mangled steel, which is hard to imagine this 1-inch thick steel could be twisted the way it is. And most people probably who listen right now live through that and have a very close personal story. But about 1/3 of the American public alive today was not alive on September 11th, 2001. And again, it goes back to making sure we never forget our history. And everyone knows that George Santayana quote of, "Those who do not remember their history are doomed to repeat it." We want to make sure that people know the history so we don't make the same mistakes
All right,
again
so
and again.
as we wrap up, Hunter, can you give us the website where people can go? Because also, obviously, if someone's listening who may be a teacher, a parent, a history buff, or a veteran. I mean, these volunteers, I want to get this in there before we end, I was very, very touched by, in the World War I, after we watched the video and walked through the trench, the volunteer guide pulls out this purple heart, and he had it in a box, and he told me his story of his grandfather serving in the war, and he later served in Vietnam. And so it was very personal for him. And these are the people that are working at the museum as you walk through. And they tell their stories. They're happy to tell their stories. and I think it's important that the stories get out. So what's the website folks can go to, A, if they want to find out more about the official opening in April, B, if they want to come in on the weekend in the next couple of weekends, where do they go to find information?
Visit our primary website at www.collingsfoundation.org.
Okay, so anybody need a pen, it's www.collingsfoundation.org. All right. Well, thank you so much for being here, Rob Collings and Hunter Cheney from the Collings Foundation and the American Heritage Museum. I will be there in April to see it in full glory.
And come for Veterans Day, too. We have a very special event, as it is the centennial of the armistice of World War I. On November 11th at 11 a.m. was when the armistice was signed, of the war to end all wars.
And it's very timely now. With elections coming up and whatnot. So thank you again to Rob Collings, Hunter Cheney, the American Heritage Museum in Stowe, Massachusetts. Entrance is in Hudson, just to make it clear. Thank you again for coming in. Greatly appreciate it. And thank you for letting me come through the museum. It's phenomenal. That's community conversations for today. I'm Vicki Green. Have a wonderful day.